Hello, and welcome to the ITPro Podcast. My name's Adam Shepherd, but this week I am not joined by my usual co-host Jane McCallion. She is on holiday, so staff writer Kumar Zafifi Sabet has once again agreed to join me as guest host. Kumar, welcome back.
Hi Adam, it's good to be co-hosting again.
So what have you been up to? How have you been keeping yourself entertained during this long lockdown?
Well, it's actually given me a chance to catch up with a lot of games I've put on hold recently. So I've completed many recently, including Death Stranding, finally, a couple of others. How about yourself?
I've been doing a fair bit of gaming myself. I've been catching up on some of the TV that I've been meaning to get round to for ages and ages. It's been not quite as materially productive as I would have hoped. I kind of started out the lockdown with kind of very lofty goals of all the books I was going to get through, and maybe I'd start some new projects. I've got a stack of Raspberry Pis somewhere that I've been meaning to do something with for ages and ages, and I was going to learn more programming and all this kind of stuff, but no.
I hear you.
Well, the first thing on our to-do list for this week's episode is to talk about SUSE and its acquisition of Rancher Labs, the open source Kubernetes management startup.
So SUSE, the open source software company, has purchased Rancher Labs in a deal worth between $600 million and $700 million. That's according to CNBC.
That's right. The deal is expected to close in October of this year, and it's a big acquisition for the German company. SUSE is perhaps best known for SLES, which stands for SUSE Linux Enterprise Server, which always trips me up because it feels like it should be SUSE Enterprise Linux Server, but maybe that's just me. But this is a major deal for the company. It's their first real big play into the container space, which has been hotly contested in terms of enterprise vendors recently.
Yeah, of course. And it looks like they're hoping to go up against the likes of Red Hat and VMware in this space.
Red Hat, of course, shortly before its acquisition by IBM, themselves acquired CoreOS and a bunch of other related Kubernetes and container management and orchestration tools. And VMware, of course, has recently launched Project Pacific and Project Tanzu, which are its big kind of Kubernetes management plays.
So the nature of the integration, I don't think it's been completely confirmed yet. I mean, it's expected to close in October 2020, but from what the CEO of Rancher Labs has said, Sheng Lang, they're hoping to build a combined engineering and innovation organization, which he says he will lead once the merge is finalized.
Yeah, Rancher has been generating a lot of buzz in the kind of container sphere, if you like, over the last kind of 6 to 12 months. It's gotten a lot of attention, and of course, the acquisition does put SUSE on a really quite good footing to go up against the likes of, maybe not quite VMware, which still has a really sizable footprint in the data center through traditional VM technology, but it definitely puts it on a really strong footing against Red Hat, despite the might of Big Blue behind it.
So moving on from mergers to standards, Intel has revealed the specifications for the next generation of Thunderbolt ports.
That's right. This is very exciting if you're a big old hardware nerd like me. Thunderbolt 3, many of you will be familiar with it as the magical do-everything port that allows you, with one cable, to get power, data, display, everything you could possibly need out of a laptop connection. It's transformative, genuinely. So Intel has published the new specifications for Thunderbolt 4, which essentially outlines the minimum requirements that a manufacturer has to meet in order for them to be able to call themselves Thunderbolt 4 compatible. So it's not just about whether or not the connector fits in the port, you have to meet certain criteria in order to be classed as a Thunderbolt 4 port. So in this case, it's predominantly around data transfer and display capabilities.
Yeah, of course. So the most significant changes, arguably, is around a doubling of the video support and the PCI speeds. So now, instead of supporting a 4K display, Thunderbolt 4 can support or should support 2 4K displays or 1 8K displays. And the minimum PCIe speeds are doubling from 16 gigabits a second to 32 gigabits a second.
So yeah, this is particularly significant when it comes to data. As we all know, data is exploding in terms of the size and availability of it. This is going to be particularly significant for media professionals, content creators, graphic designers, those kind of people who are working with, large file sizes, increasingly, 4K footage or, large digital models, that kind of thing, who need a combination of high resolution display output for maximum rendering fidelity, but also who need to transfer data on and off of external drives really, really quickly. Because as more and more people are using laptops that don't necessarily have huge onboard storage capacities, you need to be able to rapidly offload data to things like external drives, and Thunderbolt 4 and the faster data transfer speeds are going to be absolutely key for that.
So what this will do is 40 gigabits per second over 2 meters, whereas before that halved to 20 gigabits a second.
Yes.
Over 2 meters and 1.5 meters. You could still get 40 gigabits a second, but that was limited to a meter long cable.
Yes. Apple has confirmed that it will be supporting the new standard, despite the fact that it is recently announced that it will be moving away from Intel's chips to its own silicon, leading some people to fear that Thunderbolt would no longer be supported on MacBooks. But rest easy, Thunderbolt 4 will be part of Apple's lineup for the foreseeable future.
Yep, good news. And just as well, considering they helped devise a standard in the first place all those years ago in collaboration with Intel.
We should note, however, that we are unlikely to see any mainstream devices with Thunderbolt 4 compatibility until likely late next year at the earliest. The first controllers for Thunderbolt 4 will be arriving later this year, and the first actual devices carrying them will be devices from Intel's Project Athena kind of innovation wing, which will be kind of bleeding edge technologically, but likely low in terms of actual availability. And finally this week, we have the news that Huawei may soon be formally banned from the UK's 5G infrastructure. Now, Kumars, you've been covering this extensively. What's the story here? Because we've gone back and forth on this.
Yeah, it's not only that we've gone back and forth, but there's been a drip of information coming from various shady sources. Because, I mean, ever since the NCSC essentially said, yep, it's fine to use Huawei equipment, but only in a limited amount of the network, I think about a third. Ever since then, of course, there's been a wing of the Conservative Party that's just been against any Huawei involvement. So I feel as if when that report came out in January, the security question was pretty much settled. It then became a political debate as to whether we were comfortable using Chinese equipment in our national infrastructure. I mean, since then, quite a lot has changed, especially in the US and, the trade restrictions and everything, to the extent where I feel security officials now are worried that it's affected the technology itself. So now the question that was closed about security has been reopened as a result.
So why has the NCSC reversed the guidance that it gave earlier in the year? What's prompted these new security fears then?
Well, in light of the trade restrictions, I feel they're worried that Huawei now is being forced to rely on perhaps less trusted technology in their supply chain. So maybe many of the manufacturers they would have relied on in the past, they're no longer allowed to work with. So perhaps they have to rely on companies that may not meet the standards that we would expect. So in that sense, the NCSC has said, well, okay, let's take a look again at what this means, what these new trade restrictions mean. Of course, before everything was pretty much fine to some extent, but that could threaten now the equipment Huawei uses moving forwards.
So it's expected that the Prime Minister is going to make a formal announcement at some point in the coming weeks about the official government stance on Huawei and its banning or not banning. But how will this affect the 5G infrastructure of the UK going forward? Will it put us at a disadvantage? Will we have to actively remove Huawei technology from the infrastructure?
Well, I feel that remains to be seen because as of yet, there have been rumours about it. There have been reports about it that not only will we ban telecoms companies using Huawei equipment, but they're actually going to retroactively strip away existing equipment in 4G networks, for example. I know that the government has been talking with other manufacturers and other suppliers, so like companies from Japan and South Korea, but as for whether it will slow down rollout of 5G, I believe inevitably there's going to be some kind of slowdown due to this.
Huawei's role, of course, in the 5G infrastructure has been an ongoing debate for many, many months now. So this latest development may or may not actually be the end of it. But stay tuned for more updates in the coming weeks as we wait for the Prime Minister's official confirmation. Well, with that, we're going to take a short ad break, but when we come back, we are going to be talking about startups once again and how the coronavirus has impacted them.
See you after the break.
Welcome back. Now, in our last episode, we talked about startups and whether or not the coming coronavirus-fueled recession that many economists are predicting would launch a new boom in startups, as many recessions and times of economic turbulence tend to. But how has coronavirus affected the startups that are around right now and the startups that are trying to deal with the crisis as it unfolds? To give us some insight on this topic, we have brought in Andrew Roughan, Managing Director of Startup Incubator and Innovation Hub Plexal, to talk more about it. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Really enjoying it today.
So, Andrew, before we dive into the subject, I just wanted to get your take on the possibility of a startup boom following the COVID crisis and through the recovery period, if you like.
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Adam. And when I've been looking at this crisis over the course of the last few months as we've all been living through it, I've often described it as a game of musical chairs that we never knew we were playing. And I think that's ever so true of the startup community, particularly in the UK, where depending on their age, their funding status that they'd gone through, their company structure, which marketplaces they were in, where their products were in the contracting cycle, that will define how quickly they're able to recover from the COVID-19 period. Now, what I'd actually forecast is a quick recovery, a bit of a boom, and then a gap, and then a boom again. Because I think the startup community in the UK is quite resilient. I think it's got good foundations in its position on a global stage, and there's certain communities within startups in the UK that I think are ready to thrive. I think particularly around sectors where COVID has offered a new opportunity because of changing societal features around gaming and more likelihood of focus on health and medical technology, maybe more focus on well-being, maybe the emergence of VR. So I think there are some sectors out there where they really are well poised for growth. But there's also those startups out there who just found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they will have a challenge.
I suppose in light of that, would you suggest startups are in a better position than perhaps more established companies to bounce back from the current situation?
I think yes and no. I think on the positive side, everything about a successful startup is about agility and creativity, and I think it's those features that really will prove to be important over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. So the ability to take the very significant issues that are facing society and the economy in your stride, and then have the resilience in order to move forward with confidence in your product fit to market. I think that everything about that screams startup and screams a successful recovery. On the flip side of that, clearly big businesses are traditionally bureaucratic, traditionally locked in process, traditionally super tankers that find it difficult to reinvent. And boy, if this wasn't the time for reinvention being required. There is the flip side of that, though, in the startup community, where cash flow and runway for funding, I think, is going to be a significant challenge. The period of time we've just faced, lots of startups will have furloughed staff, will be running on vapor in terms of funding at the moment. And I think in that instance, you'll find a number of startups that will fail just purely because they run out of the ability to keep the business going and satisfy customer contracts. And I think it's that balance of making sure that the public perspective on startups from a government funding perspective we don't create a lost generation here of startups who almost made it, had great products, but they found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we allow the creativity and agility of that community in order to emerge and push the UK economy forward.
So, with that in mind, for any founders or prospective founders, I should say, who may be looking at starting their own startup during the current situation, what resources do you need to do that and make sure that it doesn't fizzle out in the early stages?
So I think any good startup today, in my opinion, needs to have a high quality product. So they need to be very clear on what they are doing that addresses a problem in the marketplace that someone's willing to pay money for. I think if they have that product well understood, they understand their marketplace, and then they have a route to execute on the delivery of that product, they will have solid foundations. I think the next most important thing is having the money to do it, but intelligently finding that money. So not taking in too much money up front so that you have to give too much of the company away, but living by your means over the early stage while the product's being developed, but at the time at which you can start generating customer contracts to be able to have a source of funds you can rely on to scale appropriately. And then the third thing, which is probably the most important, is guts. So you need to be resilient. You need to, deal with what it feels like not to be able to pay, people who are your friends who work with you and for you. You need to live by the seat of your pants in terms of raising money and make sure that you have confidence in what you're doing and look forward to fulfilling the plan that you've got. I think just adding COVID to that, I think you'll see quite a lot of people taking the opportunity to create startups. Lots of people being furloughed, made redundant. Lots of people seeing new ideas and opportunities in the marketplace where they can, to fill a need or fulfill an opportunity. I think for those people, I think they need to stare at themselves and just make sure they've got the entrepreneurial spirit that makes startups. I think it's easy to come up with ideas, less easy to execute upon them. And there's something about an entrepreneur when you meet them, and in Plexal we're lucky enough to have many. You meet them, they have a glint in their eye, they have a determination that won't be breached by something like COVID, and they've got this innovative step that you have confidence that they will take whatever the product that they spend 24 hours a day thinking about, and they'll be able to get that to customers.
It very much feels like one of those things, either you've got it or you don't. It's that X factor, I think, in a lot of cases.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, completely agree.
So for anyone that's not aware, Plexal is an innovation hub based in here east in the Olympic Park in Stratford in East London, and it hosts a variety of startups and early stage companies, gives them office space, gives them meeting spaces and collaboration spaces, but of course co-working spaces and incubators like Plexal, they're designed as incubators for ideas and innovation, but the nature of them also makes them great incubators for other things that are perhaps less desirable than innovation. How are spaces and institutions like this going to have to adapt in order to be able to reopen safely? Are they going to be able to reopen safely in the coming months?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I think it's one that's on the minds of anyone who operates an office space, not just the co-working community. Now, in the case of Plexal, so we've actually remained open throughout the COVID period for two reasons. So firstly, and I'll go through the safety features in a moment, but the first reason we remained open is we've got a number of companies who are classed as essential or critical workers. So they're startups, but actually fulfill a role in that space. And as a result of that, we were very keen to make sure that we didn't disrupt those efforts in order to support the COVID recovery.
Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, sure. So we've got a company who is called Badu Sports. Badu Sports work with local schools in order to augment PE staff in order to make sure that particularly vulnerable children, but all children in the local community have got access to appropriate sporting facilities. So in the time when you had vulnerable children and children of key workers going back to school so that their parents and carers could perform their efforts to support the COVID recovery, Badu Sports took on a more important role within the community, and they pivoted not only to deliver that sports functionality and the PE functionality for those vulnerable children, but also to use their infrastructure in order to drop food parcels at all of the children's community centres in order to make sure that they had appropriate meals, as some of them are extremely vulnerable from a financial perspective. Wow. We've got another couple of examples of startups that support the network within some of the mobile operators. So the telecom sector, as I'm sure you guys know very well, was one of the sectors that was insulated as a critical function. So a couple of those startups had to remain in situ. So that was the first reason around Plexal remaining open, and that very much dropped us down to a very small number of people coming into our facility every day, around about 30 people every single day. And I think the second point we remained open is part to do with our physicality. So we're lucky enough, as you said, to be at here east on the Olympic Park. So the facility that we operate is about 70,000 square foot on one floor. So it's absolutely enormous. So in full throttle, it would fit 1,000 people on a floor. And as a result of that, we're lucky enough to have enough space that we can socially distance very easily, especially when our volumes are low, as I've suggested. Now, what we've been doing since then is obviously planning a full return. So how are we going to get ourselves in a position where we can safely welcome back the majority of our membership and get back to those sort of vibrant numbers? Now, lots of this is around what we do in the physical space. So the cleaning regime, the transport regime, how do we make sure that people can get to the facility safely? In that, we're thinking about micro-mobility, about cycling, about public transport, about car parking, all of those boring things that are integral to everyone's day, but you don't want to spend too much time thinking about it. On a cleaning side, with increasing our cleaning regime, but particularly looking at frequently touched areas, so things like door handles, which in a traditional sense one wouldn't spend too much time worrying about how clean the door handle was. Now everyone's extremely sensitive about it. Again, boring things like reconfiguring our air conditioning to make sure that it only takes fresh air into the air conditioning system, so there's no recirculation of that air, and making sure that we can demonstrate safety to the individuals who are here, so they can make sure that they can visibly see it. So stickers, markings, making sure that people are spaced out when they're sat at desks, and really giving them boundaries so that people who are uncomfortable being near to people can advertise it. One particular thing we did was we put in place a lanyard scheme. So a coloured lanyard means something different. So in particular, if you had a red lanyard, that would imply to people you weren't comfortable anyone coming anywhere near you. And a yellow lanyard, you were comfortable adhering to the 2 metre space and people could approach you to that level. So just visually symbolising to people and giving them that confidence. We're lucky enough to be on the ground floor, so we don't need to think about lifts, which I suggest is causing a lot of big companies a lot of problems at the moment. So how do you efficiently get people into big towers? But as I said at the start, I think this is a big concern, challenge and opportunity, I think, for the property sector to step up and understand what we've learned from this last period and how does it react in order to recover, but also to be appropriate to the users of the space. And I think there's many sides of that, which I'd very happily go into in terms of company culture versus community versus flexible working, and that future of work subject matter I think is going to really come to the fore in the near term.
I completely agree. How might you see working practices change in co-working spaces moving forwards? I know you said you've kept your doors open during the pandemic, but I suppose over time, ideally with more businesses coming through your doors, you would try to return to some sense of normality.
So I think both operators of co-working spaces and companies within them, I think their recovery will be built on a return to flexible working. So I think you're going to see a lot more of what we describe as flock systems, but rotations of staff through a building in order to get them used to coming back to work, but not imposing on them the volume of people that typically would be there. And I think we're going to start to see a change in customer mix. So I think it's much more likely that people who used to commute to a city location, say London, who would much more prefer to only go to a headquarter building when necessary, but actually work somewhere that gives them community and facility closer to home. So I think those co-working facilities that exist near pockets of residential areas or suburban areas, I think are well placed to serve that community that either can't work from their kitchen table. So you imagine you're a young professional, you're in a flat share of 4 people, and for the last 3 or 4 months you've been sat on your bed with your laptop. I don't think that's acceptable long term. So I think you're going to see a real changing mix of the users of co-working spaces, and obviously a debate as to how that's paid for. But I think particularly in our case, we're lucky enough to be in East London, which is a real hotbed for talent. And I think we're even starting to see our mix change near term around the likelihood of local people wanting to work in a facility like this, whilst their brands sit blinking at us in Canary Wharf or the City of London, and they can go to those headquarters buildings as and when required, but not hugely regularly.
One of my experiences working in a startup a few years ago was that personal touch can really keep you going. That idea that you are part of a team, you keep going to the same office, seeing the same people, and you carry each other through all the tasks you basically, or the task you need to do. One thing I suppose with the introduction of mass remote working is I would worry that element could be lost somewhat. Is there any easy way of replicating that? And are many startups likely to lose that, especially in the short term?
So I think it's a big problem. I think that's across big and small businesses. So how do you create a company culture that means anything? So not just the cereal packet company culture, the one where your employees buy into it, they represent it, and then they continue to live by those company values, and it means something to them and they get something from it. I think in a significantly flexible and or remote setting, I think it's nigh on impossible to do. And I think what that might proliferate is less buy-in to big business, so less buy-in to the big brand that actually when you scratch the surface, they can't really live by the values they've got because they don't have mass influence on those executing the task. I think from a startup perspective, I think places like Plexal and there are many co-working facilities around London, but we create a culture within our community. So we do that by not filtering people on the way in, but making sure that we've got subject matters of relevance that will appeal to certain groups. So we particularly specialise in cybersecurity, in mobility and transport, and in social inclusion. What we like to do is if you've got a company that comes from any of those backgrounds or is building products to address any of those challenges within those sectors, we'll make sure that the community spirit is really start to build around that. So all of our networking events will have subject matter content related to that. We'll make sure that we're matching staff so that if there's founders that need to get together or operations staff that might welcome a chat to each other, we're creating that culture and almost acting as the hub to the spoke where the startup is sat on the spoke. So making sure that where the big company culture isn't present, we build that community on behalf of the almost 1,000 people that sit within our building.
So, Andrew, obviously many organizations and many startups in particular are struggling and will continue to struggle to deal with the fallout of the current crisis. Is the government providing enough support and guidance to startups to get them through this?
I think it's a good question. It's one I've been asked a few times over the course of the last few months, and I think the simple answer is no. I'm extremely sympathetic, and I have a lot of admiration for what the government has done over the course of the last few months in terms of its heroic efforts and sums of money it's putting into the recovery. I think the plain fact, though, is that almost all startups have only been able to avail of the furlough scheme. Every single other package, whether it be the future funds, C-bills, the business rates relief scheme, almost all of them do not qualify in for startups, and there's several different reasons for that, which we'll touch on. So as a result of that, the startup community is reliant on the fact that they're furloughing staff, which then makes them less productive and then slows their efforts in raising funds, delivering to contracts, in continuing on their journey. So I don't think in the long term that's attractive to anyone. Now, the funding packages the government has put in place. So the Future Fund, if I touch on that, so that was a £500 million fund, of which £250 million was the government contribution. The remainder came from private VC, venture capital, that is. The £250 million is, in relative terms, I know it's bizarre saying this, but it's such a small amount of money for the startup community, which currently numbers 650,000 in the UK. So the Future Fund itself, I think, was 25% of it was subscribed on day one. And to this date, which is 2 months later, there's no extension of that Future Fund, albeit there's lots of commentary around how it might. So the fact is the Future Fund is fantastic for those that are beneficiaries of it, but it's just not open to enough people. I think secondarily, the C-bills, the business interruption loan scheme, has a test on viability. Now, there are not many startups in this land who are profitable, and that's the whole point of being a startup. You invest in research and development, you invest in talents, and you go after your marketplace and you make your money later. So C-bills and the equivalent schemes, because they test on viability, therefore profitability, they count out startups. And then finally, the business rates relief scheme, which offered a grant to startups of £10,000. Sorry, not just startups, everyone within the community qualified for it. And the vast majority of startups might sit in facilities like mine, a co-working space, and they don't pay business rates. So again, they never had the opportunity to apply. And there were some successor schemes that again counted against the description of what a startup is. So frankly, there just isn't enough, and the startup community predominantly is left to their own devices, with private sector starting to hopefully bear some of the burden of it. That said, as I said at the start, I'm a great supporter in what the government has done, and they cannot save every job. I just worry that we might create a lost generation here, where what we do is stunt the growth of the very young companies who have just started or maybe 12 months into their journey, and we just create this maybe 2-year gap. And that 2-year gap, I don't think will get any better as a result of what's going on in higher education. So the risk that some higher education institutes start to fail, less research gets done, less ideas get created, less startups emerge. I think there's a very sensitive period of time here where we need to look at the innovation pipeline within the UK and just make sure that we are doing what we can within the realms of economic reality in order to support those groups.
So to end on a slightly less bleak note, what would your advice be for startups who are looking to weather the crisis and dig in the best they can?
Sector by sector, I think understand your marketplace and how it has changed, because every single sector will have changed as a result of the experience of the last few months. And then I think double down on the quality of your product. The high quality startups will survive this period. It will be difficult, but they will access funding and they will thrive. If you understand what your product can do, what problem it can address for your customer, and then go after it. And I think really accelerate out of this downturn and put everything you possibly can into getting to market quickly, because you'll be faster than the bigger alternative.
Well, unfortunately, that is all we've got time for in this week's episode. I'd like to thank Andrew Roughan from Plexal for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And thanks to you, Kumars, for stepping in as guest co-host again.
Not a problem.
Always a pleasure to have you on the show. You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today and even more on our website at itpro.co.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn. And you can subscribe to the ITPro newsletter for a daily dose of IT news in your inbox. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you get podcasts. And we'll be back next week for more news and analysis into the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
The ITPro podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.